Hello, hi. I am back and I am here to talk about the show Caroline or Change. Now, I have avoided this show like the plague. A lot of people have asked me to do it. A lot, as I mean, you know, 5 people have asked me to talk about it. But honestly, it's such a dense and uncomfortable show for me that I've just been avoiding it because it just seemed like so daunting to get into it. But here we are, and you know, I feel refreshed and ready to talk about it. Hopefully my opinions don't come across the wrong way, and you know, regardless of what I'm talking about, I'm never individually attacking any of these people. Like I think that they're all wonderful creators. I admire them all a lot, but when it comes to Caroline or Change, my thoughts are my thoughts. And surprisingly, when I first saw the show, I actually really liked it. And then the more I dissected it and the more I thought about it, I did see the valid critiques in it. And I think that just goes with, like, you can change your mind when you may really like something and then later on discover that, you know, it has some problems. And that's what this is going to be today. So, in my opinion, the white gaze is embedded all over Caroline or Change. Too often, I think the Broadway community lets those on Broadway, mainly white liberal people and men, get away with kind of baseline racism. Like, racism is bad, but you're an ally with no fault, so it's okay. There are shows like Hairspray, Memphis, just so many shows that kind of have this like white gaze like on it, and instead of properly like dissecting and feeling uncomfortable with what's happening on stage, I think people are just willing to accept the faults and not really criticize them. And I also think that has to do with a lot of the people who review Broadway shows are mainly white men, so they're not going to see the same things that maybe someone else would see, right? And I think we're just so quick to praise Broadway and theater for building these kind of groundbreaking shows instead of really looking at the cracks in the foundation. Like, there are unethical behind the scenes work, there's stereotypes, there's the white gaze, and affordable ticket prices that kind of plague Broadway, but we refuse to look at them, I think, because we're so like attracted to the shiny, pretty thing. I also just want to interject, a lot of things have been happening in Broadway currently with like casting, and I think using like tokenization as like a positive thing that I've seen in Broadway. Like, currently Brittany Johnson um made her debut as like the first Black Glinda, and that's like been super lauded on Broadway, but personally that's not a good thing. And even Titus Burgess spoke out about that. I'm just gonna include like a picture screenshot so you can see, but like, yeah, like this like praising of like, wow, Brittany Johnson's the first Black person, like that's not good. It's 2022. We shouldn't be like applauding the first Black anything anymore. Obviously I applaud the Black people who have done it, but that shouldn't be a good thing on the side of Broadway. And I think that's what Caroline or Change is. It's a beautiful show, no doubt. It's got some amazing costumes, some really just strong vocal performances. It's got amazing things, but when you really start to look at the show from like a critical eye, things start getting a bit uncomfortable. So Tony Kushner said, it's a tragedy, I think, in terms of Caroline's journey. And as Kushner has repeatedly stated, Caroline or Change is his favorite work. It's based upon his own childhood and is dedicated to his childhood nanny, Maudie Lee Davis. The musical is not strictly autobiographical, but it does reflect, I think, Kushner's memories through the lens of a critical and historical moment. And I think that that's really important to think about this show, that it really is Kushner's memories and how he sees them. And that's important because we're going to talk about how kind of problematic that is in terms of if we're thinking about this idea that Caroline or Change is groundbreaking or that it's a Black musical. And as James Fisher explains, the merging of historical and the personal, in this case for Kushner, the deeply personal drives Caroline. The musical is an expressionistic staging of the inner life of its central character, who is trapped in a life of poverty and longing for the life she surrendered to economic necessity. Today I will pose as to why Kushner, basing the story on his own life and his own gaze and experience within the Black nanny, is a weird, unreliable, and white savior position in which to make a Black musical. This is why I feel uncomfortable with Caroline or Change, and maybe why you should too. And if you see me glancing at my laptop, it's because that's where my notes are, and that is very important in such a dense show like Caroline or Change. Now, you are going to have to bear with me in some of the instances, like when I talk about the plot or the people involved in this musical or what it stands for, because it's gonna be dense, and I'm not gonna have the normal time that I have to kind of break it apart and talk about the cast and where it started. Like, that's not that important to me, especially in the case of this show, because I think that there's better things that we can talk about, and those other plot points about who made the show have already been talked about. I will include like small info, but I'm not going to go into the expansive library of knowledge like I normally do. So let's talk about the plot of Caroline or Change. The plot, keep in mind, is almost entirely sung through, kind of like an opera. There's not really a lot of like spoken dialogue in this show. The plot of Caroline or Change is kind of hard to sum up, so I'm going to give you bullet points in a sense, but it's going to be long, and the reason why it's going to be long is because I have to tell you everything that happens in the show in order for you to understand what I'm getting at. So if you don't like spoilers, I would say you can't watch this video, or go and watch the video, maybe a bootleg of Caroline or Change, and then come back, because I have to spoil it for you. I'm sorry. Caroline is a black maid who works in Lake Charles, Louisiana in 1963. She works for the Gelmans, a rich white Jewish family. They have a son named Noah who is a little obsessed with Caroline, and he pines for her affection, as in some way he reminds her of his recently deceased mother. Regardless, Noah has a stepmother named Rose, and the whole family kind of hates one another. They're just deeply unhappy. Oh, also, Caroline has a son, but he's serving in Vietnam. That's not super important, but it kind of is, so I have to include that. By the way, also, in the midst of all this, while Caroline is working as a maid, she has these kind of singing voices in her head which sing to her, and these voices are different kind of like characterizations of the moon, of the laundry machine, of the dryer, of the bus, different things like that. There's a whole kind of interworking of what that means, and I'll include links down below, but I don't have time to get into all of that research. But just so you know, she does have these kind of voices in her head that speak to her, and they kind of act as her inner thoughts and her conscience. So getting more into the plot, Caroline needs more money, but the family says that they can't or they won't give it to her, because it seems like they do have enough money to give her a raise. But in order to teach Noah a lesson, Rose tells Caroline that if Noah leaves any extra money in his pocket, that Caroline can take it. Noah wants to live with Caroline, and he imagines this kind of world in which he lives with them. Their last name is a Thibodeau, and he wants to be a Thibodeau, basically. Oh, also JFK is talked about because he died, but that's just a song. Back to the plot. So Noah wants to be a Thibodeau, right? And he knows this money thing because Rose tells him, like, by the way, you know, if you leave your money that we give you for lunch and comic books in your pocket and you forget to take it out, Caroline gets to take all of it. But because he knows about Caroline's situation, he decides that he will intentionally leave money every day in his pockets, and I believe it's like 75 cents. So this kind of leaves Caroline with like a hard decision. She's like, I don't want to take it, but I kind of have to, because like my family doesn't have enough, and like my kids should be able to have the same opportunities that Noah has, and I hate to have to scrounge for money from like an 8-year-old, but I have no other choice. Caroline has 3 kids. She brings the money to them, and they kind of sing this random song about Christmas. And then somewhere between that timeline, the Gelmans, or rather Rose, the stepmom, offers kind of Caroline more money through pants pockets of Mr. Gelman. And this somehow upsets Caroline this time, because she's like, I don't need a handout, but like, girl, just take the money. So basically all this happens, and there's a Hanukkah party, and Rose is like, hey, do you mind if you like work this party, and then also like, can you bring your daughter and like Dottie, and like Dottie's her friend, your daughter, and like they can help. But during this Hanukkah party, Emmy, who's one of Carolyn's daughters, her oldest one, has kind of a fight with the Gelmans and their own ideologies about MLK and nonviolence. And somehow the Gelmans pose that actually you need to be violent, and like an argument ensues, but actually they kind of like it because they're like, wow, Emmy is really like well spoken for a black girl. Okay, so then during the Hanukkah party, Noah gets money. He gets $20 as a gift, but this time he leaves it in his pocket on accident, and Caroline finds it and keeps it. Now Noah gets upset about this, and it kind of leads into this big like rift where they call each other different racial slurs. It's pretty intense, and this is like the peak tension of the show. But in the end, Carolyn says that the money has made her greedy. She goes to church and she kind of repents in a heartbroken way. She goes back to work, she gives Noah the money, and she tells Noah basically that their relationship has changed forever. Also, I want to make a small correction. Some productions of Caroline or Change have Caroline's children as all girls, like the one that I saw, but other productions have like a mixture. She has a daughter and 2 boys. Like, it's kind of all over the place, so take that with a grain of salt. But for the reference of this video, let's just assume that Caroline's children are all girls, but either way, the statement still stands. In the end, it's Emmy that tells her sisters that it's up to the 3 of them to change the world in the future. So let's get into the background now that I've talked about this plot. The musical was first workshopped in 1999 at New York's Off-Broadway Public Theater. If you know anything about theater, you would know that the public has produced many shows, and it was directed by George C. Wolfe. I will mention him later. So it would go on to premiere, I think the date was November 30th, 2003. It then transferred to Broadway at the Eugene O'Neill Center or Theater on May 2nd, 2004. And then it closed August 29th, 2004 with 136 performances and 22 previews. So it didn't last on Broadway that long, but I mean, Broadway's kind of a gamble and you never know when things are gonna open and close. It was critically acclaimed though, even though it had a short run. It was nominated for 6 Tony Awards, including Best Musical, but it actually only took 2 away. One went to Anika Noni Rose for Best Supporting Actress, and then the second one went to Janine Tesori for Music. Then in October 2006, there was a London production at the National Theatre of Caroline or Change, and it was also directed by Wolfe. It then went on to have a revival in the West End in 2017. Now the 2017 version that was in the West End is the one that recently also transferred to Broadway again. Now this one was the second time that it had a Broadway revival, and it was at the Roundabout Theater Company. It was announced to start previews on March 13th, 2020, and then open April 7th at Studio 54. But because of the pandemic, that didn't happen, so it did end up opening again October 22nd of 2021, and then it recently closed January 9th of 2022. It's definitely one of those shows that has been on Broadway in the West End a couple of times, but it just never really had that much success. Like, even now, if it opened October 27th, technically you would probably want it to stay on longer than that, but it just didn't. And I think there's a lot of reasons for this. Caroline or Change is very like, I think it's like a theater person's show, not a I'm going to New York, I should see a Broadway show type of show, if that makes sense. So the original cast included Tanya Pinkins as Caroline. We've talked about her before. She was in Jelly's Last Jam and plenty of other shows. She's kind of a Broadway like star. Like, she's got a lot of things under her belt. It had Anika Noni Rose as Emmy, Harrison Chad as Noah, Avianne Cox as Rose, and then Chandra Wilson as Dottie. And then the choreographer was Hope Clark, which I'm not gonna have a lot of time to talk about like the specific crew, but I just want to highlight that Hope Clark is so important in the Broadway landscape. Like, she's done some really cool things, and she's a Black choreographer, which is pretty cool. It had scenic design by Ricardo Hernandez, costume design by Paul Tazwell. We've talked about Paul before. Also another black scenic designer, and he did win an award for this scenic design, which is pretty amazing. And then the lighting design was by Jules Fisher and Peggy Eisenhower. Again, they've done many shows on Broadway. I will include links to their shows. They are not black, but they're acclaimed on Broadway. So I just want to say props to this show for having like a black costume designer, a director, and a choreographer. That's pretty cool. Still not enough. Still not enough. And I do want to point out that the person who wrote the book and the lyrics was Tony Kushner. Let's get into a little bit of his background. So Tony Kushner is like a well-acclaimed and popular playwright. His most popular play is, of course, Angels in America. It did have a mini-series produced by HBO. It's really good. I highly recommend. Long, but good. And then his most recent work has been on the 2021 West Side Story. He wrote the screenplay for it, which is interesting. And then he has many plays, operas, books, TV series under his belt. Kushner was born in Manhattan, New York. He's the son of a bassoonist and then a conductor slash clarinetist, which is pretty cool, and it makes sense as to why he is so interested in music now. His family is Jewish. They descended from immigrants from Russia and Poland, and then shortly after his birth, his parents moved him from Manhattan to Lake Charles, Louisiana, which is where the show Caroline Interchange takes place. His undergrad college education was from Columbia University, where he received his bachelor arts degree in medieval studies, which is pretty interesting. Like, medieval studies, I love it. And then he attended Tisch School of the Arts, NYU, later on in his graduate career. Next, I do want to talk about George C. Wolfe, who was the director for both the public theater show and then the Broadway version, at least the first two. So I can't kind of like do a video on Caroline Interchange and not mention him. He did have some influence, and I would go into a ton of like background on him, but I actually already did. If you want to check out more about George C. Wolfe, he's a very accomplished director of both movies, TV, plays, musicals. You can check out my video on Jelly's Last Jam, where I talk about like his career. But to sum it up, I will say that he usually does take a very big part in, you know, the plays that he directs. Just because he didn't have a maybe credit writing doesn't mean that he didn't, you know, introduce some things in this show. He probably had a very big influence. But at the same time, I don't always love George C. Wolfe's work. Sometimes I find his stuff to be a bit especially when it comes to black women. But that's just my opinion. I respect him, but meh. And then there's also Tanya Pinkins, who originated the role of Caroline. Again, she usually does a lot of work connected to George C. Wolfe. It's just they're kind of like partners in art. Again, really respect her. Next, I do have to mention Janine Tesori, who is the kind of music composer of the show. Now, Tesori grew up in Port Washington, Long Island. Her father was a doctor, her mother a nurse, and although she played piano from the age of 3, she actually ended up going to Barnard College with trying to get into like the medical profession, and then she ended up teaching like a summer kids theater camp, and she just fell in love with music. Now, she is one of the most honored female theatrical composers in history. She's got 5 Broadway musicals that she's won and 5 Tony Award nominations. Her major works include Fun Home, Caroline Interchange, as in this video, Shrek the Musical, Blue, which is a more recent one that was premiered at Glimmerglass Festival. It's an opera. Modern Millie, the 2017 version, or the more updated version. And then she also did Violet, Kronk's New Groove, Mulan 2. I mean, the list goes on and on. Even though she's done some incredible shows, I will also say that she does not come without controversy. I don't know that much about Blue. I will be probably doing a video on that, but something that I find interesting about Janine is that I appreciate her work, but I'm confused in where she has the right to write things about Black people, especially Blue, which is about police brutality and Black boys. I would love for her to stick to Fun Home and Shrek the Musical, but I just don't understand what's going on with that. I will be including some videos down below where there's interviews with Janine. I think, like I said, she's an amazing composer, an amazing lyricist. Like, I unironically love Shrek the Musical. I do, but it's weird. The score for Carolina Change combines spirituals, blues, Motown, classical music, and Jewish klezmer music, as well as folk, and it kind of puts this all together in an operatic style show. The music is absolutely beautiful. Quote, "The musical as a genre of utopia transformation has taken on a formative, defining role in the construction of a collective sense of America. Kushner and Tesori invoke the legacy of the American musical in order to question the racial images and emotional attachments that hold together. Carolina Change incorporates elements from Porgy and Bess, The Showboat, Hairspray, and Dreamgirls, only to revise the stories of racial harmony that these have produced." Unquote. Now you can start to see where some of these issues are taking place, because Porgy and Bess, Showboat, Hairspray, and even Dreamgirls have had plenty of criticisms about their racial stereotypes and just stereotypes in general, in addition to the white gaze, because most of these shows, actually I want to say all of those shows that the show is inspired by, are written and created by white people. And I wouldn't even say that even by those days' standards, people loved Porgy and Bess or Hairspray. Like, when those shows came out, I think a lot of people had criticism for them, but they just weren't a part of the larger, majority, so people kind of didn't listen to their criticisms. I want to be super clear in what I'm saying, so I want to say this again, but what I was getting at is the fact that I feel like a lot of the time, like, white liberals try to have this mindset of like, oh, well, we were poor, but we had great values and we learned. But in reality, being mature for when it's age, which the Thibodeaux are, and thinking about money is a sign of trauma. Racism is trauma. It's not something where we learn lessons at the end of the day. Like, yes, we learn lessons, but it's trauma. It's traumatic. And I really wish that there were more shows that highlighted the fact that that is a thing. It shouldn't be applauded. It shouldn't be celebrated. It should be, maybe these kids shouldn't have to live in racism. That's the main point of the show. So they're not necessarily richer. They just have to be able to survive. Alright, so I rambled and talked a lot about the plot, its background, but what I really want to get at is the controversy and this show's problems, in my opinion. Like I said, don't think that I'm calling out a specific creator or Tony Kushner or saying that I don't. I love all of their work and I think that they're good, but I also think it's important to break down shows, and just because I like them doesn't mean that they're above criticisms, okay? They absolutely are. Like I said when I was talking about the plot, in the end, it's really posed that the three of Caroline's daughters are going to be the ones to change the future. Emmy tells them this, and in the end they kind of hold this like defiant gaze under the moon where they're saying they're gonna be the ones that carry the hope. And while I think that that's great, I do have to ask, why does this show put the changing of the future solely on these three women, specifically these three Black women? It really doesn't make any sense to me. Throughout the show, these Black children have almost no emotion, no fear, no anger, no sadness, nothing but this kind of intense resiliency, and they deeply lack any humanity except for being strong in terms of both activism and for their mother. Now, I do believe absolutely that Black women are historically incredibly resilient, but I actually pose that resiliency and our resiliency is due to trauma. Or let me rephrase, I'm gonna put this in my own terms because I don't want to speak for all Black women, but I will say that as a Black woman, my resiliency does not come because I want it to. It's actually because of intense trauma that I faced and that my ancestors have faced. I'm gonna break that down and explain that to you, but I think it's very important when we think about Caroline and her 3 children and how they are posed. There's something called John Henryism, and according to Google, it's a strategy for coping with prolonged exposure to stress, such as social discrimination, by expanding high levels of effort, which result in accumulating psychological cost. John Henryism is based on the myth of John Henry. If you don't know who this person was, he was a real life man, I believe, who worked on the railroads, but he did die from an increased exhaustion because he worked himself too much. Now, I think that this story was told and carried on through Black storytelling traditions in a way that kind of posed John Henry as a hero. He was a hero because he worked hard, but actually the story really continued to live on because it's just a show of American capitalism and exploitation. Like, yeah, work on the railroads, and also kind of an exploitation of the manifest destiny, but that's a whole nother conversation for a whole nother time, because the railroads were manifest destiny and capitalism. But anyways, John Henry kind of lived on through this tale, and it kind of became this tale that a lot of people would tell as a way to say, like, keep working, and you know, John Henry was so brave because he worked himself to death, and that's what we should do. The term itself, John Henryism, was conceived in the 1970s by an African-American epidemiologist, I think that's how you say it, and public health researcher. His name was Sherman James, and he discovered this while he was investigating racial health disparities between Black people and others in North Carolina. Now, I'm gonna attach both a TED Talk about John Henryism, but also just an article that talks about Black women and resiliency and how that's actually kind of a bad thing for us. But to expand back to what I was saying about my own resiliency kind of being this like double-edged sword, I have a lot of resiliency because I am extremely traumatized by racism, by misogyny, and because I have no other way to live. I really don't know what it's like to not have to fight every day, and that's not a good thing, but I'm just saying I don't know what it's like to not fight for my own self-worth and self-being. Now, I'm slowly unlearning that, but all I've ever had was the option of being strong and being resilient, but all I've ever wanted to do is just have a moment to be truly human, a moment to make mistakes, to cry, to break, to scream, to throw something at the next Karen who calls me well-spoken. But being resilient with no chance to breathe is traumatizing, but I have to be resilient because if I lash out or if I do something wrong, I am marked for that, seriously marked, in a way that other people who are not Black women are not marked. Other people get to make mistakes. Yet in this show, resiliency is seen as inspiring. Actually, I'm gonna say that in a lot of Broadway shows that portray Black women, they usually are shown as resilient, and that's something heroic. I talked about this in some of the other Black musicals that I reviewed, specifically Once on This Island, and I think that it would be better to move on from this type of thinking. It's something that I'm even trying to unteach myself, and it's one of my main issues with this show. It's Noah in the show who instead is allowed to have these kind of full ranges of emotion. The story is set in Noah's own eyes, and it's from his own perspective. The idea that Kushner bases on his own life is what makes this musical so tricky, because it means that Kushner has his own stake and his own gaze into the story. I'm not even going to get into the issue when it comes to like white children characterizing Black women as like mother figures, because that's a whole nother type of historical stereotype, and I am definitely thinking about the help when I mention this. But that's just a whole stereotype that I can't really get into, but keep it in mind because I think that that plays a really big role in how Noah feels about Caroline, especially in the beginning. I think that if this show is truly about Noah and his own blindness to his privileges and his own internal white gaze when it comes to classism, which I think is very powerful, I'm just confused as to why the show does not pose it up to him to actually change as well. I understand maybe not wanting to have a white person's view in the story, but if it's already embedded into the story, might as well be there anyways. He's really not given any sense of agency in the end, and he looks upon his unfortunate mistake of calling Caroline a slur with kind of confusion. He is given a sympathetic pass, and I can't help but think that this may be Kushner projecting himself into the story. Now, I know Noah's only a child, but children do turn into adults. Boomers who learned racial prejudice and ignorance grew up to be people that we are still fighting today. Noah being omitted from this just undermines kind of this entire lesson and story, but instead places the weight of all racial injustices upon the backs of Black women once again. Because at the end of the day, even though George C. Wolfe and Tanya Pinkins had a hand in the show, it's still dominated by white creators. They didn't make the book, and they didn't write the lyrics, and they didn't do the songs. So their only impact, in my opinion, really comes down to the choreography, the blocking, the costumes, the little nuances of character. But I don't think that they really changed the script, and there's very little evidence that shows what George C. Wolfe and what Tanya Pinkins did in the musical. I don't know. So my camera died, which, you know, happens. So this is another day. Things are not as perfect as they normally are. And this is where I really need to bring in the fact that I think that these stereotypes do damage and perpetuate the notions about Black and white people that need to be broken. So I'm going to talk about Caroline's ending song, which is called Lot's Wife. It's absolutely a very vocal and powerful song, no doubt, but in order to talk about the song, we need to talk about the origins of the song. So Lot's wife, historically, or I should say biblically, is not a hero. She was told to not turn around and look at the city that's filled with sin, but instead she does, and is thus turned into a pile of salt. This is really important to note because when I tell people the fact that at the end of the play Caroline does not change and that she in fact stays the same even though she apologizes, Caroline asks God to forgive her for her justifiable anger, but we are told in the song that we either have to be a Caroline or change. People usually get really upset at me when I say this, the fact that you have to be a Caroline or a change, and I'm always confused because I'm like, did we see the same show? That's absolutely what the plot is called. Either you're angry and you're a Caroline, or you change. So again, we've got this angry Black woman stereotype coming into forefront. Caroline historically and justifiably should be angry, and it's not pocket change as Kushner positions it that makes her angry. Yet somehow she's posed in the same category as Lot's wife. Now, I'm not saying that her calling anybody a racial slur, or I guess I should say just a Jewish slur, necessarily is a good thing. It's not, and obviously that is something that needs to be resolved at the end of the play. But I also want to state the same fact that Noah also calls her a slur, and he does not face that same penalty. In fact, I don't really think he feels bad, nor does he know what he's really done. Yet Caroline is so upset that she asked to be punished by God for her mistakes, right? Most people will disagree with me when I say this, but for backup, Sharon D. Clark, whom I love and who was in the recent production of Caroline or Change, did just say this, quote, "She doesn't have the capacity to change. In fact, she says, changing's a danger for a woman like me. For me, she thinks as long as she can get her kids through their lives, that's going to have to be enough. She feels it's too late for her to change. She looks at her friend Dottie going to college and mixing with a new crew, and she knows she doesn't have the money to do that for herself. Dottie has a boyfriend, she doesn't have any kids, and she doesn't have any dependents. Dottie has a completely different lifestyle from Caroline. Caroline does try to move herself forward because by the time we get to the second act, she's found out where Vietnam is. She has somehow had it shown to her on a map, so she knows where her son is serving. I think there are these myriad of worries that don't allow her to change in the same way others in her community do. As you said the word, change in the title is multifaceted. There's the change Noah goes through growing up and letting go. There's a change in the household with Noah's father getting remarried. There's a change politically. JFK has been assassinated. The civil rights movement is forcing change. The whole world is changing around her in a way that Caroline just can't. So for me, she's the one character that doesn't change. End quote. Boom. Thank you, Sharon D. Clark, for hitting the nail on the head. Caroline does not change. Therefore, we are told that we either get to be the parable of Caroline, which is a bad thing, or we should change. Now, I find this highly problematic because if we're talking about the fact that Black women are resilient, wouldn't Caroline also be just as resilient? And I don't understand why we have to be posed that being angry is necessarily a bad thing. Anger can fuel you. Obviously, it can also stop you from doing many things. I'm not saying that it's the best tool, but I'm also saying that I would love to see a show that doesn't just paint Black women as happy and resilient all the time. I mean, sure, this is up to interpretation, but I also think it's strange that they should place Caroline in a position like that, especially without giving any proper nuances. They just kind of make her the villain. Caroline isn't even really a good mother, to be honest, and she is submissive to white people, except Noah. It's strange. It's a little insulting and confusing because I do think that there are some very strong moments in the show, but when you really start to dig deep and think about Caroline as a character, there's just so many flaws. I think the reason why people really love this show or talk about how good it is because honestly there's an allure to it, right? It's got this like level of like pretentiousness that's put on it that just makes like theater people love it instead of actually thinking about it critically. There's a lot of different things going on in this show, and I think that it's just, I love that it's not digestible, but I can't really stand by with its ending message. So that is it. That's my statement, and I'm sticking to it. I don't think that Caroline or Change is a good Black musical, nor do I think that it's one that offers any promise or anything new in terms of how it portrays Blackness, because it doesn't. It's not really concerned with Blackness. I'm more concerned with Kushner's own autobiography of his life, and while I think that that's very endearing, I don't think that it helps anybody. But I again want to say that I don't have any ill will to these people. I just think we need more musicals about Black people just in general, because we can't just keep holding the whiz up. Anyways, thank you for watching. Let me know if you've seen Caroline or Change. I want to know all the details, and thank you for watching. Bye.